on, Gene.
Okay, I'll go ahead and start then. First, I'd like to welcome everybody to this webinar, but I'd like to make an apology to all of our participants. Number one, we set this up as a webinar, not realizing that as a participant, you wouldn't be able to actually interact with us other than through the chat room. So you can interact by chat, and Rich, who you can see on the screen, will be monitoring the chats. So if you have a question for Coty or a comment or anything else you want to say, go ahead and send it, and Rich will be taking care of that. And so this is an experiment, so everybody be patient. And then what we're going to do next Tuesday, we're actually going to have a meeting where members will be able to participate, and we'll have reports from all of our various working groups, because in spite of this COVID situation, we're still moving forward with our activities, and there's a lot of exciting things coming along. And of course, the main thing that I want to remind everybody about is the Giving Challenge that's coming up next Tuesday, starting at noon. And so make sure you have your credit card starting at noon and make a donation to our sister organization, Florida Veterans for Common Sense Fund, which is directly dedicated to supporting and helping our fellow veterans. And you could take a look at the fund website or go to the Community Foundation, where we're a qualified giving partner, and you can find out about us. Or if you have questions, call me or call Rich. And so with that being said, we'll go right into the program because Coty has a lot of ground to cover.
Oh, Gene, one other thing. If people have questions, please type them into the Q&A section. You can see the icon at the bottom of the screen. Just click on that, type your question in, and then Coty will answer questions at the end.
Yep, and for those of you that just came in, I apologize because we set this up as a webinar, not realizing that people wouldn't be able to participate and we'd all be on the screen, etc. So we'll correct that with the next meeting. But in any event, Coty Keller, who's a great member, he was our Volunteer of the Year a couple of years ago, is our speaker tonight. And Coty is a local ecologist and a Florida Master Naturalist, and that's not easy for some guy that comes down from the north. And he's a Vietnam combat veteran, and he served 20 years in the Navy, and during that time he commanded 2 different ships, and he taught national security affairs at the Naval War College. His second career was as a college professor teaching graduate level management. He has a bachelor's in psychology, a master's in finance, and a doctorate in decision science. So Coty has really an incredible amount of experience, and he's going to present a great program tonight on killer heat in Southwest Florida. So Coty, take it away.
All right, Gene, thank you. Good evening, everyone, and thanks for being here. On the 50th Earth Day, if my count is right, and it's only fitting that we should gather together as inhabitants of our common home and talk about stewardship for our planet. We have a couple of problems to deal with. One is the looming specter of global warming. More and more Americans are very concerned about this issue and want government to take action. It's an especially stressful issue, in part due to the political and cultural divisions in our nation. The other problem is that problem solving and decision making themselves are by nature stressful to many people. Making climate change and decision making, or mixing climate change and decision making, is not pleasant work at all for most human beings. But given the importance of the climate crisis, we must make these decisions, even if it is stressful. Tonight we will try to leave the politics and emotions aside and focus instead on the basics. We will work on developing a clearer view of what our climate choices are and the consequences of our choices, so we can make responsible and well-founded decisions. This presentation has adapted from a 2-hour course given at Florida Southwestern College this winter. So we're going to have to move quickly. And we'll cover 4 concepts in the next 45 minutes before we get to questions and answers. The heat consequences of our choices. We'll explore the Union of Concerned Scientists Killer Heat Program to get an idea of what we're facing and what our choices are. We'll explore exactly what is meant by the term that they use, rapid or bold and aggressive action, which is one of our choices. What does it mean in general terms, in specific terms? This is going to involve getting into some abstract concepts, such as climate adaptation and mitigation. We'll also get into the details of the timing and the scope of what needs to be done. Maximum leverage. To implement rapid action, we will have to apply force where it will have the greatest impact. Who should be doing what at the various levels of government to achieve the most leverage that we can achieve possible? In economics, critical decisions should always be made with consideration to the economic consequences of our choices. After a summary, we'll have question and answers. And as Rich and Jean said, there's an icon probably down at the bottom of your screen that has Q&A. You can start typing your questions in anytime you like. And then, oh yeah, there'll be a quiz, but you won't get it till tomorrow. And I won't grade it. You don't have to send it back to me. You'll get it with a follow-on email tomorrow night. The idea is that you can use the quiz to review what's been learned tonight. The Union of Concerned Scientists issued a detailed report in July of 2019 with interactive computer graphics that can help one really get a picture about the temperature aspects of climate change. By using the interactive features of the Killer Heat Report, we can gain insights into the consequences of our choices. This interactive mapping tool shows the rapid widespread increases in extreme heat projected across the whole United States due to climate change. Information is presented by county and includes all 3,109 counties in the contiguous United States. For the national analysis, extreme heat is measured according to the heat index, the combination of temperature and humidity that together create this feels like temperature. 4 different heat indices are featured, each of which brings increasingly dangerous health risks. You have above 90 degrees Fahrenheit, above 100 degrees, above 105 degrees Fahrenheit, and off the charts. Off the charts days are so extreme that they exceed the upper limits of the National Weather Service Heat Index Scale, which starts topping out about a heat index of 127 degrees, depending on the combination of temperature and humidity. The report has 3 different time frames: historical, mid-century, which covers the period from 2036 to 2065. So when we think about mid-century, the front end of that is only 16 years from now. If I'm lucky, I'll still be around then. That's not far off. And then we have the late century time frame, which is a period of time from 2070 to 2099. And then finally, 3 scenarios of climate action are considered: no action, slow action, and rapid action. So let's get into this program now and examine Sarasota County for a 105 degree heat index. We'll look at historical, mid and late century, and then we'll look at for the no action scenario, and then we'll look at the rapid action scenarios. Okay, God willing, I'm going to be able to shift over to my browser Okay, so I'm looking at my web browser now, and I've got the Killer Heat program. And you can get to this just by Googling Killer Heat in the United States. And it'll take you right to the Union of Concerned Scientists program. And if you need the URL, I'll be sending it tomorrow night with the follow-up email. So before we get into an analysis of Sarasota County at 105 degrees, take a look across the top of the screen here. You can see there's a tab for introduction, which tells you the stuff that I just told you. You can look at 90 degrees, 100 degrees, 105 degrees, where we'll go in a minute. You can look at off the charts information. The military bases at risk is especially interesting to us at Florida Veterans for Common Sense because it shows the vulnerability to high temperature of all the military bases in the US. And we don't have time to get into this tonight. That could maybe be a separate topic of a separate webinar. But some of the bases in Florida are going to be cooking and uninhabitable, basically, in the not too distant future. So we're going to, as I said, we're going to look at 105 degrees. In Sarasota County, which is somewhere down here in Florida. Okay, we're in the area. The first thing we're going to look at is the historical. I'm doing this right. We got historical. Sarasota County. Yes. Historically, Sarasota County has experienced an average of 5 days a year with a heat index above 105 degrees. So we can use that as a point of reference. That's what was observed in the 30-year period between, I think, 1970 and the year 2000. So now we're going to go look at what happens if we just keep what we're doing. Let's just keep on doing what we're doing. No action on climate change. By mid-century, Sarasota County, we can see the result of the projection. If we fail to reduce heat trapping emissions by mid-century, Sarasota County would experience an average of 86 days a year with a heat index above 105 degrees, with 1 day off the charts. Okay, we can kind of put that into perspective. That's as early as 16 years from now, 2036. We're looking at almost 3 months a year with a heat index above 105 degrees. And by late century, Sarasota County, if we don't do anything about heat trapping emissions, we're talking about 135 days per year with the heat index above 105 degrees, with 21 days, it's like 2/3 of a month of off the charts heat index. Again, off the chart is something above about 127 degrees Fahrenheit. And that could be as early as 2070. Okay, finally, we're talking about choices. Let's see what would happen if we take rapid action on climate change. Rapid action is bold and aggressive action to dramatically reduce heat trapping emissions and limit global warming to somewhere what we had in mind with the Paris Climate Agreement. Okay. If we take bold and rapid action now to reduce heat trapping emissions, we can limit the increase in extreme heat in Sarasota County to an average of 60 days a year with a heat index above 105 degrees. Going back to my slideshow here. Okay, the interactive website has a place where you can go and enter your city or county. Here's a screenshot of what I got when I went to Sarasota County and above 105 degrees. And you can see this summarizes the information we just found on the GIS map. In other words, historical average has been about 5 days a year above 105. If we don't do anything, by mid-century, as early as 2036, we could be looking at 86 days a year above 105 degrees, with one day a year off the charts. Again, we're looking at almost 3 months a year with a heat index of 105 degrees right here in Sarasota County. Last week I did Charlotte County. By late century, as early as 2070, where we're currently headed is 135 days a year, like 4.5 months a year, with a heat index over 105 degrees Fahrenheit, and 21 days off the charts, like 127 degrees heat. If we take bold action now to reduce heat trapping emissions, we can limit the increase in extreme heat in Sarasota County to an average of 60 days a year with a heat index of over 105 degrees. So even if we take bold and aggressive action, it's still going to get uncomfortable compared to our historical average of 5 days a year. Let's think about this a little bit. Writing in the Sarasota Herald Tribune last year, Carlos Munoz gave us a local perspective. He said these climate impacts will dramatically alter life in Florida in our lifetime. Today, the only place in the country that experiences this kind of heat is the Sonoran Desert in Arizona. This kind of extreme heat is more than uncomfortable, inconvenient, and expensive. It's a major health risk. When extreme heat conditions prevent our bodies from adequately cooling, our core temperatures rise, especially during periods of prolonged exposure. Heat stress and then heat exhaustion follow as body temperatures rise upward. Once the body's core temperature reaches 104 degrees Fahrenheit or higher, heat stroke, the most severe heat-related illness, can occur. Older citizens could die if they lost their air conditioner for a few hours. Munoz said that the implications of this analysis are profound. In many places, extreme heat will lead to an increase in deaths or illnesses. It's going to disrupt long-standing ways of life, force people to stay indoors to keep cool, and perhaps even drive large numbers of people away from areas that become too unpleasant or impractical to live. We would be seeing people, climate refugees, fleeing Florida, said Mark Paul, a professor of economics at New College. We face a stark choice, to use the words of Christina Dahl, the author of the Keller Heat Report. We can continue on the current path and extreme heat will soar, or we can choose rapid, bold, and aggressive action and prevent the worst from becoming reality. It's time to examine our choices. We know what the status quo is. Do nothing. That's where we're currently headed. What we need to learn is, what does rapid and bold action mean? It's important that we understand what rapid action in the Keller Heat Report means. To describe what's entailed in this choice, we have to go beyond the Keller Heat Report. We draw on research and analysis from the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, the IPCC, U.S. government agencies, and the Environmental Working Group at Florida Veterans for Common Sense. We will first describe the concepts of climate adaptation and mitigation to explain that rapid action is mitigation. It's not adaptation, sometimes referred to as resiliency. Then we will get into the specifics to define bold and aggressive action in terms of its scope and timing. What the Union of Concerned Scientists mean by bold and aggressive action can be generally described in the context of the concepts of adaptation and mitigation. Adaptation is defined by the IPCC as the process of adjusting to actual or expected climate change. The adaptation approach is often equated with the concept of resiliency and includes protecting existing infrastructure, homes and people from rising seas, fires, stronger weather, and other changes. Mitigation, on the other hand, is defined by the IPCC as human intervention to reduce heat trapping emissions reduce heat trapping emissions or remove carbon already in the atmosphere. Adaptation can be thought of as managing the unavoidable. Mitigation can be thought of as avoiding the unmanageable. To deal effectively with climate change, we must both adapt and mitigate. Communities that embrace the concept of adaptive mitigation, those that help their residents adapt to a changing climate while also reducing emissions and sequestering more carbon, are better positioned to remain livable in the years ahead. Clearly, we cannot focus exclusively on adaptation or resiliency, as seems to be the trend in Florida right now. If we do, the climate will continue changing and the long-term impact of global warming will be too severe to manage. We must mitigate. When we talk about rapid action to avoid extreme heat, we're talking about mitigation, not adaptation or resiliency. Okay, we know rapid action is about mitigation or human intervention to reduce heat trapping emissions and remove carbon already in the atmosphere. Let's get more specific. Our best scientific information, these 6 reports listed on the left-hand side of the slide, tell us that we must immediately implement policies that will achieve what's on the right hand of the side of the slide. The first is reducing the amount of heat-trapping gas going into the atmosphere. And there's 2 interrelated actions with that. First, we have to use less energy, that is, consume less. And second, we need to transition to zero-emission energy sources. This includes solar, wind, nuclear, hydro, geothermal, energy that doesn't pollute. These reports tell us that we only have about a decade, that is by 2030, to implement such policies. And I cannot overemphasize the need for conservation. No matter how swift the transition to modern energy sources, we must reduce our energy consumption or we will never get to zero emissions. So we need to conserve and we need to replace. And then the second action is to remove excess carbon already in the atmosphere through reforestation, more effective soil management, and by emerging technologies. The problem is caused by too much heat trapping gas in the atmosphere. And the carbon stays there for a long time. If emissions went to zero tomorrow, the problem would not be solved. We must also ramp up the amount of photosynthesis going on and bring new, unnatural means of carbon sequestration online rapidly. So what is rapid that is bold and aggressive action. It's radical mitigation. Radical in terms of scope and radical in terms of timing. It's got to be a lot of it, and it's got to happen in the next 10 years. That is, if we want to achieve rapid action. Okay, before I leave this slide, and as an aside, I have to say that the 6 reports on the left-hand side also explain the consequences of doing nothing in terms other than extreme temperature. We're just talking about temperature tonight, but other outcomes of doing nothing include sea level rise, extreme weather events, drought, floods, famine, climate refugees, loss of species, and our ocean resources as well. We're focusing on temperature today, and extreme heat is not nothing. But in the grand scheme of things, the cost of not taking action in rapid, bold, and aggressive fashion is more than far-reaching heat, is more than killer heat in Southwest Florida. Okay. The illustration on the right shows the problems and the solutions to achieve the necessary drawdown in resident greenhouse gases from the atmosphere. This is the stuff in the box up here. By 2030, we must on average reduce emissions, this red stuff on the left, the bad stuff, almost 8% annually, or 70 to 100% in all by 2030. And then we need to take grand steps in reforestation and soil management, the green stuff on the right, to suck the resident carbon out of the atmosphere and store it in the soil, letting photosynthesis do its thing. This is a huge challenge that can't be met unless all levels of the global community participate. This means international organizations, nations, states and provinces, local governments, businesses, individuals, all doing our part. Tonight, we will not talk about international efforts or what individual or businesses can do. That'll be the topic of another webinar. These are important, but the topic of this webinar is going to focus on what must be done by governments in the United States, where we can get the most dramatic results, according to the expert advice from the Union of Concerned Scientists. The concept of leverage is used in mechanics as well as finance and economics. We have a simple machine, such as a pry bar, where a small amount of force can be applied to move a heavy object. In finance and economics, we use a relatively small amount of resources to achieve large results. The Union of Concerned Scientists and Florida Veterans for Common Sense have analyzed the various levels of government to evaluate which sorts of policies can get the most impact, the most leverage, the most dramatic reduction in emissions, and most effective removal of carbon from the atmosphere. And this is an election year. It's not unreasonable. In fact, I'd suggest it's our duty to help the candidates recognize the need for these policies and to pledge to adopt them as a condition for earning our votes. We'll now present the policies that deliver the best bang for the climate, starting at the national level. For decades, economists and behavioral scientists across the political spectrum have agreed that an efficient way to reduce greenhouse gas emissions is to put a price on carbon. The concept is to account for the social cost of the pollution from fossil fuels and alter behavior in the marketplace. As the price of fossil fuels goes up, people will buy less of them. The concept has been proven to work on lower scale and lesser scales in economies around the world. A steadily increasing price on carbon has proven itself to reduce the amount of greenhouse gases emitted. The idea of a carbon tax has been rightly criticized as being regressive, and that the most vulnerable in society are the most burdened by increasing the cost of energy. This problem can and has been remedied by returning the revenues to families so they can afford the price increases. There's actually a bill before Congress as we speak, with bipartisan support in the House, the Energy Innovation and Carbon Dividend Act, H.R. 763. And studies modeling the impact of this legislation are very favorable. They show it reduces emissions on the order of magnitude of 40% in 10 years. It bolsters family budgets, especially for lower income families, as monthly dividends are greater than the increases in energy costs. It creates jobs by increasing demand for non-emitting energy. It stimulates the economy because families have more money to spend. It improves people's health and saves people money because of reductions in air pollution. It's a very powerful tool and would take care of 40% of the 70 to 100% reductions we need to achieve by 2030. The current pandemic is something most of us have never experienced in our lives. We are currently focusing on the immediate problem confronting us. We must consider what happens when we are through the coronavirus crisis. The economic situation resulting from COVID-19 requires rescue and/or economic stimulation indeed. Meanwhile, we know we have 10 years to make radical progress in reducing carbon in the atmosphere. The last thing we want to do is jump from the frying pan, the pandemic, into the fire, the killer heat, the crisis we have with our climate. The fossil fuel-based growth economy we have had for so long is inherently unstable and should not automatically be reinstated when we have an opportunity to improve it. We cannot afford to spend the next several years in pandemic recovery doing business as usual. All data about global warming lead to the conclusion that business as usual is the worst case scenario for climate. We should heed the warnings from scientific experts. The economy must be recovered in a way that significantly reduces fossil fuel use and removes carbon from the atmosphere. The current crises, pandemic and climate, show us the cost of failure to pay attention to science. And we need now to pay attention to science. We need a pandemic recovery plan that puts people to work in a sustainable economy. An economy that, unlike our present growth economy, limits consumption to what the earth has to offer and supports companies that replace fossil fuels with zero emission sources of energy. It's a pandemic recovery response that creates millions of new jobs in zero emission and carbon sequestration industries, meanwhile establishing a sustainable economy. A good way to start this kind of recovery and stimulation is by enacting the Energy Innovation and Carbon Dividend Act, which will effectively reduce carbon emissions, create jobs, and improve people's health. H.R. 763 will not be all we need to do, but it's a good start. And it's time to act now when politicians are suddenly willing to spend vast sums of money. Because states regulate utilities, their primary role must be, number one, to establish low carbon energy portfolios with a target of 100% zero emission electricity generation by 2030. And two, to change utility business models to require conservation by breaking the link between a utility's profits and the amount of electricity it sells. Regulators have to change the rules so utilities don't make more money by selling more electricity. As explained by the Natural Resources Defense Council, electric utilities should not be viewed or regulated as if it were a commodity, dependent on growth in electricity sales to keep its owners financially whole. This outdated model creates a disincentive for investment in energy efficiency, clean energy generation, and many other important customer choices that can reduce their consumption and their bills. Instead, utilities should be customer service needs and our goals for reducing energy consumption and greenhouse gas emissions. Futurist Tony Seba uses the term regulatory capture to describe situations like what we have here in Florida. The public is being regulated by a government serving the interests of the industry and working against the people. In states like Florida, the government established additional barriers to rooftop solar at the bidding of utility companies. Barriers to the use and practical distribution of solar energy should be eliminated, including making it legal for community or shared solar programs which allow multiple utility customers to connect to one shared solar installation. Right now in Florida, it's illegal for apartment house dwellers or condo owners to share one solar system. Building codes, landscape and farming rules, and public transportation are controlled by cities, towns, and counties. All provide opportunities for energy conservation, sequestration of atmospheric carbon, and transition to zero-emission fuels. In Florida, we have the additional leverage, the potential leverage, to be gained as a result of recent peril of floods legislation, which has mandated that counties upgrade their comprehensive plans by 2021 to address sea level rise and climate change. Our view is these plans must include adaptive mitigation, a strategy that protects residents from global warming while at the same time strives to reduce emissions to near zero by 2030 and takes carbon from the atmosphere by reforestation and soil management. It's very important that we fight against what I see as a trend in Florida towards focusing exclusively on resiliency. I see this trend in Florida with the appointment of a climate czar with the title of Chief Resiliency Officer. In Charlotte County, the Director of Development has said that 2021 plans will not consider the cause of sea level rise and warming. In other words, they're going to omit mitigation. 3 counties in Southwest Florida, Lee, Collier, and Charlotte, are working on a regional plan. It's not going to be called a climate plan or a mitigation plan. It's going to be called a resiliency compact. I see all these indications of omitting mitigation and focusing solely on adaptation. Again, adaptation is needed, but without mitigation, we have no rapid action. Killer heat will be experienced in the worst case. The climate will continue changing, and the long-term impact of global warming will be too severe to manage. To choose bold and rapid action is to mitigate. One of the age-old arguments against investing in a modern energy future is the alleged harm it would do to the economy to leave all these fossil fuels in the ground. There's plenty of evidence to suggest the contrary, that investments in energy conservation and a transition to zero-emission energy would improve our economic well-being. We'll get to that in a minute. But first, let's give credence to the most recent IPCC report on global warming. What the report said was, absent radical changes in energy policy and human behavior, we should expect severe economic and humanitarian crises by as early as 2030. Let's think about this. What's the economic outlook in Sarasota County with 135 days a year of 105-degree heat with 21 days off the chart? This alone is cause to consider abandoning the status quo. Avoiding the worst by adapting to a changing climate while reducing emissions and removing carbon from the atmosphere gives us a chance for long-term economic prosperity. We have everything to lose by not acting. Even without the specter of an economic and humanitarian crisis, the outlook for modernizing our infrastructure is more than promising. Zero-emission energy is already cost competitive, if not outright cheaper, with prices falling dramatically, than fossil fuels. Solar with storage is on a par with natural gas in some regions of the country already. Solar and wind energy are returning a healthy return on investment for individuals, businesses, and utilities, while stimulating the economy and creating jobs. Health benefits from reduced pollution, just think about no smokestacks and no tailpipes, translates to dollars and lives saved. And by the way, the national price on carbon returns revenues to households, helps lower income family budgets, and stimulates the overall economy. Economics, in the long run, is an argument for rapid, bold, and aggressive action. So we've spent the last 40 minutes or so describing the temperature consequences of our choices in Sarasota County, where historically we have experienced on average 5 days a year of 105-degree heat. If we choose to do nothing, continue the path that we're on, we are headed by mid-century, as early as 2036, for, on average, 86 days, almost 3 months a year, with a heat index above 105 degrees. This includes 1 day with off-the-chart heat index. By late century, as early as 2070, an average of 135 days, 4.5 months per year, with a heat index of 105 degrees. This includes 21 days with an off-the-chart heat index. If we choose instead to take bold action, bold and aggressive action, rapid action, now, we can limit the increase in extreme heat in Sarasota County to an average of 60 days per year, with a heat index above 105 degrees. Bold and aggressive action is defined as climate mitigation, human intervention to reduce heat trapping emissions on the order of magnitude of 70 to 100% by 2030, and also removing carbon already in the atmosphere. Climate adaptation, the process of adjusting to actual or expected climate change, is needed to protect our communities. But adaptation does nothing to reduce soaring heat. We cannot focus exclusively on adaptation or resiliency, as is the current trend that I've observed in Florida, because the climate will continue to change and the long-term impact of global warming will be too severe to manage. We must mitigate. Bold and aggressive action is grand in every sense of the term, and will require radical policies to be implemented at every level of government. At the federal level, we need a national price on carbon that returns all revenues to households. Also, a pandemic recovery response that creates millions of new jobs in zero emission and carbon sequestration industries, meanwhile establishing a sustainable economy. At the state level, we must install low carbon energy portfolio standards that have all electricity generated by non-emitting energy sources by 2030. We must also change utility business models to require conservation and focus on service and reducing emissions instead of selling electricity. We must also allow community or shared solar. At the local level, we need energy conservation, sequestration of atmospheric carbon, and transition to zero emission fuels via building codes, landscape, and farming rules. Counties must include adaptive mitigation in their comprehensive plans for 2021, plans that protect residents from global warming while at the same time striving to reduce emissions to near zero by 2030 and take carbon from the atmosphere by reforestation and soil management. Doing nothing or doing too little to mitigate climate threatens the whole economy with collapse. Meanwhile, there are positive economic benefits from the transition to zero emission energy. Health benefits from reduced carbon pollution translates to dollars and lives saved. Looking at the temperature consequences of our choices and the economics, it seems the choice is clear. To limit future extreme heat and have a prosperous economy, we must take rapid, bold, and aggressive action. In this election year, candidates at all levels should be informed of the need to support policies that limit future extreme heat, and that our votes are conditioned on their pledge to do just that. Before we open the floor for questions, let me warn you that the webinar is not over. Tomorrow, I hope to make a quiz available to each of you. It won't be collected, but you can grade it yourself. The idea is for you to review what you've learned about what our climate choices are and their consequences. Also, we will share a handout from the Union of Concerned Scientists called Extreme Heat in Florida's 16th District. You can see the projected days of extreme heat in the 2 counties of the district and how bold and aggressive action can alter the impact of killer heat in our region. At the bottom of your screen, you should see a question icon. Just click on it. And if you haven't asked a question yet, go ahead and type in your question or comment. I'll do my best to respond.
Rich, are you gonna?
Yep, I'll jump in here. So we have a lot of good questions. Not sure we'll get to all of them, but first one up is easy from Gary Farner. Coty, are you going to distribute the slides or a PDF of the slides? A couple of people have asked this.
Yes, I will. There's 2 ways we can do that. Either you can, tomorrow we're going to send an email and it will have the quiz or a link to the quiz. And it will also have a link to the Florida 16 district. We could either, it'll also have my email address. If somebody wants the slides, they could just email me and ask me for the slides and I'll send them to you rather than burden everybody with them. How about that?
That sounds good to me.
Okay, just ask me and I'll be happy to share them.
Okay. And we have
Thanks for asking.
Yep. We have a few questions together from Steve Martin. The first, I'll just read them all 3. Do these numbers apply to much of the state? What are the projected effects of 86 days of 105 degrees Fahrenheit on agriculture? And can FPL possibly provide the power for air conditioning alone for the 86-day scenario at 2036?
The numbers that I gave were specific for Sarasota County. This is about, does it apply to the rest of the state? If you go, you'll have to go into the program and click around. You can see it for any place in the country, including all the other counties or all the other congressional districts. And it's quite amazing. I did this presentation to a group in Charlotte County last week, and Charlotte County, even though it's further south, is actually is going to be a little bit cooler in the future than Sarasota County. And I questioned that because it seemed counterintuitive. And the report author, Christina Dahl, explained to me, she went into the data to verify that it was correct. And in fact, she could see that Charlotte County was more temperate because it has more coastal area than Sarasota County, which has more inland area. So these numbers are not specific to the whole state. You need to look around. But I think the general, and you can, if you go to the program, you'll see that the general trend is a national one. It's generally getting hotter in other places. It's getting hotter in Florida relatively, by my brief interpretation, than it is in other places. For example, we also live in New York in the summer, or have in the past, and it's looking a lot better in New York than it is in Florida, that's for sure. I mean, I can't imagine enduring 4.5 months of heat above 105. And the time I spend down here in the summer, you know, it gets over 100 one day or two while I'm here, but I'm still able to work around the house in the morning when it's cool. I can't, it looks like it's going to be uninhabitable. But anyway, bounce around the state on the map, and if you need help doing that, send me an email, but the program is really easy to work with. The effects of 86 days on agriculture, I can only imagine that it would be bad, but I'm not a farmer. And I do know that it seems like it would make an incredible amount of difference from our farm, the Warden farm, based on what they tell us about how they farm and the amount of days they have to work, and most of it's in the winter when it's cooler. So I really am not an expert in that area, and I have to defer to a farmer. FPL with the air conditioner, that would be totally counterproductive to what we're trying to do. We must reduce energy consumption. And if we're going to crank up air conditioners to take care of 86 days of 105-degree heat, I can't imagine what that would do to the grid. I mean, it would make it almost impossible to make the transition to zero emission energy when we have to reduce our consumption. It would be a problem. When I did this course at the college in Punta Gorda earlier this year, one of the students who was a nurse said she could not imagine what would happen to some of the elderly people if they lost their air conditioning for a few hours. It would be deadly. So, good question for FPL.
Okay, we have a couple here from Linda Denning. They're similar to a few others. And that is, does HR 763 have any chance of passing intact by the Senate? And what will it take to create the political will to accomplish the bold actions proposed?
These, I'm not going to be really good with these questions because I'm, I know what has to be done, and I'm not a political strategist. I have spent some time lobbying for this 763 or its forerunners. Does it have a chance in the Senate? Again, it has a chance. I don't know how strong that chance. It hasn't even been introduced in the Senate yet. But I do know the Senate has just created a bipartisan climate caucus, if you will, who is, have members from both parties thinking about taking action on climate change. And in the House, if my understanding is right, the Energy Innovation Bill was conceived by the bipartisan climate caucus. So is there hope? Yes, there is hope. And I think the whole, if more people like you, Linda, and the rest of us are bothering our senators and our representatives and only voting for people who are going to support this kind of legislation, there'll be a better chance of it. So,
Okay, great.
we can't fight for it. We have to fight for it.
So here's a couple of questions from Maren Holden.
Did she give a disclaimer?
No.
Okay.
Daughter-in-law. How can I influence people to change their perspective on the environment as you do? And do you think people will change their harmful habits after the pandemic when realizing our impact on the earth during this time?
Maren, I really don't know. I would be hopeful of that. You know, my wife is about once a week says that things are going to be different after the pandemic passes, that people will have different perspectives. So I hope that that's going to be the case. The question about influence, that's a tough one. I mean, how do you influence people? You have to talk to them. You have to present facts. I mean, it's tough for people who make the decisions or are going to cause these policies to be enacted. That is, people at the local, state, and federal level. One way to influence them is to explain to them what's needed and why you believe in it, and then tell them that your vote is conditioned on them enacting these sorts of policies.
Okay, so it's a couple of minutes after 8 o'clock. I think we said we'd go till 8, so I think I will cut the questions off there, but I have captured all of them, and I can send them to you, Coty, and then can answer them individually or put them in the answers tomorrow. I mean, there's some other good questions that we didn't get to. So want to make sure that everybody gets an opportunity to have their questions answered, even if it's not directly on the webinar. So
thanks, Coty, and sorry for jumping in, Rich, but we are about to run out of time. And I would just like everybody to give Coty a big virtual hand of applause. Coty, thank you very much. Job well done, of course. And we apologize to the group. We're sorry with this webinar format that you couldn't participate more, but we're going to make that up next week. We're going to take another shot at a FLVCS meeting next Tuesday night. We have that tentatively scheduled. So watch your notices and tune in. And what we're going to do is report on what all of our groups are doing, all of our working groups. Even during this pandemic, there's a lot of things that are going on. And some of the questions that were asked Coty, our group's working on some of those. So we're making some progress. And so watch your notices and everybody be safe. As far as I know, up to this point, no one in our group's been infected. Some people have been exposed, but no one's been made sick yet. So let's keep that up and maintain your social distance, and we'll see you next week. Thanks, Coty.
Thank you all for attending. Here's to Mother Earth.
Here's to Mother Earth.